Temple of Seti I at Abydos, in a corridor that tour groups are not taken through. A wall of hieroglyphs runs for nearly 4 meters at the height of a standing person. The carvings are deep, the limestone is white, and carved into the lower register, the section closest to the floor, is a list that no published translation has ever fully addressed. Not the famous Abydos king list that Egyptologists reference in every textbook. A different list, on a different wall. Selim Hassan noted it in 1941. He called it a pre-dynastic ruler list he could not classify. He moved on. Hassan photographed it. He filed his notes. He died in 1961. The photograph sat in the Cairo Museum archive for decades. And what they show, when read as the administrative document they appear to be, is a record of 5 groups that governed before the pharaohs. 5 civilizations, each named, each described, each with a territory, and each with a specific ending. Not symbolic endings, not mythological metaphors. Endings described in the same verb-precise administrative language the Egyptians used for recording crop failures and flood damage, and the deaths of officials. In the next several minutes you will see who the 5 civilizations were, what the hieroglyphs say ended each one, and why this panel has never appeared in any mainstream Egyptological publication. This is a truth that has been ignored for a very long time. Make sure you stay with me until the very end, because what follows may completely change the way you look at human history. But here's what makes this stranger. The panel does not stand alone. The Turin King List, a limestone tablet held at the Turin Museum in Italy under catalog number CAT 1874, contains parallel pre-dynastic ruler sequences that use the same 5 group designations that appear on the Abydos wall. The Palermo stone, a basalt slab held in Palermo, contains related notations. The 3 sources cross-reference each other, different materials, different locations, different centuries of production, and the same 5 names in the same administrative register. The word used across all 3 for the pre-dynastic groups is akhu. In Egyptian administrative texts, akhu means those who came before. It is the same word used in Egyptian legal documents to describe the prior owners of inherited land. Not ghosts, predecessors. All 3 sources describe the same thing. 5 prior administrations. And the Abydos wall describes how each one ended. This is not speculation. This is not a fringe reinterpretation. The Abydos Temple of Seti I exists. The corridor exists. Selim Hassan's 1941 survey notes exist. The Turin King List exists in Turin. The Palermo stone exists in Palermo. What follows is what the Abydos panel describes when read in its literal administrative sequence, not filtered through the assumption that nothing significant preceded the pharaohs. The inscription begins with the first group. They are designated Shimsu Hor, the followers of Horus. The hieroglyphic rendering uses a walking legs determinative, a small marker that tells you the word describes beings in motion, beings who travel, not beings who are stationary or abstract. The Shimsu Hor are moving. Their territory is described as the land at the edge of the Great Water, coastal territory. And their ending uses the verb sejef, extinguished, paired with the water marker, not symbolic water. The marker used for the annual Nile flood, for irrigation channels, for real bodies of moving water. The Shimsu Hor were extinguished by water. Their coastal territory was submerged. The geological record of the period before 12,000 BCE documents exactly this: the Younger Dryas meltwater pulse, a catastrophic rise in global sea levels from collapsing glacial ice sheets that inundated coastal settlements across Northeast Africa and the Near East. Whatever the Shimsu Hor built on low coastal ground, the sea took it. And the Abydos panel records it with the same matter-of-fact brevity a modern insurance adjuster uses to record flood damage. Property lost to water, administration ended. But the inscription doesn't stop there. The second group is designated Necheru, the ordered ones, those who follow law. Their determinative is the seated figure with a staff, the marker used for authority, for administration, for those who hold and enforce order. The Necheru are not divine beings in the supernatural sense. They are administrators. Their territory is described as elevated ground, above the floodplain. And their ending uses a verb that appears only in the context of ground movement, Huesef en ta, repelled by the earth itself. The ground became hostile. The land they stood on shifted beneath them. Seismic events in the geological record of Northeast Africa during the prehistorical period have been documented at sufficient scale to render entire settled zones uninhabitable through liquefaction, the process by which saturated soil loses structural integrity during earthquakes and behaves like fluid, solid ground becomes moving ground. Buildings sink, foundations fail. The Necheru's elevated territory rejected them, and the Abydos panel records the mechanism in a single verb. What follows on the second register is stranger still. The third group carries the most detailed entry on the panel. They are designated Majat, the recorders, those who set down the count. Their determinative is the scroll marker, the same symbol used throughout Egyptian administrative texts for written records, for archives, for the act of documentation. The Majat kept records. The hieroglyphic description of their civilization uses a phrase that translates as those who held the count of all things, and then adds a notation that Selim Hassan's survey describes as unusual in construction, a phrase that specifies what happened to those records when the Majat ended. The records were carried forward by those who followed. The Majat's knowledge archive survived their civilization. It was inherited. This single notation changes the entire picture of why Egyptian writing, mathematics, and astronomy appear fully formed at the dawn of the First Dynasty, sophisticated, standardized, and in use across a bureaucratic system too complex to have been invented from scratch. They were not invented. They were received, carried forward from the Majat by whoever came after them. And the ending of the Majat uses the atmospheric marker Khasef and Shu, repelled by the air. Something in the atmosphere made their civilization impossible to sustain. The Abydos panel does not specify what changed. It specifies only that it changed, and that the Majat could not survive what the air became. The Medjit knowledge inheritance is the detail that changes the entire timeline of Egyptian civilization. Egyptologists have struggled for over a century to explain the absence of a developmental record for Egyptian writing. Every other ancient writing system shows clear evolution. Primitive pictographs becoming more standardized over centuries. Cuneiform in Mesopotamia has a visible developmental arc. Chinese script has a traceable evolution. Egyptian hieroglyphics appear in the earliest dynastic records already fully formed. Complex, standardized, capable of expressing abstract concepts, already in use across a bureaucratic system covering hundreds of kilometers of territory. The standard explanation is that the developmental period has not been found yet, buried under Nile floodplain sediment. Possible. But the Abydos panel offers a different explanation. The writing system did not develop inside Egyptian civilization. It was received from the Medjit, carried forward. The Medjit's notation on the panel is the only entry that specifies what happened to its civilization's knowledge. Every other entry describes an ending. The Medjit entry describes a transfer. That is not mythology. That is an administrative record of inheritance. The atmospheric ending of the Majat also connects to the Shamsuhor flooding event in a way that makes both more credible. The Younger Dryas period, roughly 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, included not just catastrophic coastal flooding from glacial meltwater, but also major atmospheric disruption from volcanic activity. Multiple large eruptions injected sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere, triggering temperature collapse across the northern hemisphere. A civilization dependent on specific atmospheric equilibrium would have found its survival parameters eliminated within a generation. The Shamsuhor coastal flooding and the Majat atmospheric rejection may not be separate events separated by thousands of years. They may be two consequences of the same cascade, two civilizations, two endings, one geological period. And then comes the part that stops the argument cold. The fourth group is designated Akhet Keru, those of the horizon sound, or those who spoke from the boundary. Their determinative combines the horizon glyph with the mouth glyph, beings associated with both the edge of the visible world and the act of speaking. Their territory is described as the boundary zone, neither highland nor coastal, but the transitional land between. And their ending is not catastrophic. It is the most chilling entry on the panel precisely because of what it is not. The verb used is hem, to diminish, to become less, to decrease. The Akhet Keru did not end suddenly. They declined, slowly. Their numbers fell, their territory contracted, and the final notation on their entry uses a phrase meaning they were absorbed, taken into whatever came around them, not destroyed, outnumbered. The demographic ending, something grew while the Akhet Keru declined, and that something did not need to fight them. It only needed to outlast them. The final line is the one nobody quotes. The fifth group is designated Zep Tepi, the first time, the original moment. This term appears throughout dynastic Egyptian religious texts as a theological concept, a primordial golden age. But on the Abydos panel, it appears as an administrative entry, with a territory, with a reign notation, and with an ending that uses no catastrophic verb, no marker for water or ground or atmosphere. The ending notation is a single construction. They withdrew to the first place, not extinguished, not repelled, not diminished, withdrawn, deliberately, to a location described in Egyptian as the place where the count begins, a geographic reference that appears in no other inscription in any context that allows it to be identified. Hassan's 1941 survey notes flag this line specifically. He writes, "The withdrawal notation has no parallel in any administrative text I have encountered." He does not speculate further. The Zep-Tepi were not destroyed, they left, and the Abydos panel does not say where they went. The Akhet-Keru demographic decline has a resonance with a pattern in the archaeological record that researchers have named but never satisfactorily explained. The transition from the pre-dynastic period to the first dynasty in Egypt is marked by what archaeologists call a cultural discontinuity, a period in which material culture, burial practices, and artistic conventions change rapidly in ways that do not follow a smooth evolutionary line. Something replaced something else. Not through conquest, there is no evidence of the violent destruction of pre-dynastic settlements at the scale that a military conquest would leave. The replacement is demographic and cultural. One set of practices stops appearing, another begins. This is what the Abydos panel describes for the Akhet-Keru. They diminished, they were absorbed, not fought, not exterminated, replaced demographically by something that grew around them until they were gone. The cultural discontinuity in the pre-dynastic record is the archaeological signature of a demographic transition that the Abydos panel recorded in a single verb more than 3,000 years ago. The 5 endings taken together form a sequence that moves from catastrophic to subtle to voluntary. Water, ground, atmosphere, demographics, withdrawal. Each mechanism less violent than the last, as if each successive civilization had learned something from what ended the one before, had become better adapted to the physical dangers, had developed resilience to flood and earthquake and atmospheric collapse, until the 5th one faced none of those dangers, was not threatened by any environmental mechanism, and chose to leave anyway, to a place the panel calls the first place, where the count began, whatever that means, whatever place that is. The Abydos wall does not explain it, and nothing else in the Egyptian record does either. What the standard translations leave out is how precisely the physical record confirms the first 3 endings. In 2012, a study published in Quaternary Science Reviews by Dr. Peter Clark at Oregon State University documented catastrophic coastal inundation events in Northeast Africa between 14,000 and 9,000 years ago, events that would have eliminated any low-lying coastal civilization in those regions, leaving almost no recoverable trace. The scale of what the sea erased in that period is not speculative. It is in the sediment record. The Shemsu-Hor ending is in the sediment record. In 2017, a team from Cairo University and the German Archaeological Institute conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Giza Plateau, radar that sends pulses into the earth and maps what bounces back, the same principle as sonar for solid ground. The survey detected geometrically regular subsurface anomalies at depths between 4 and 12 meters beneath the Sphinx enclosure. The boundaries were too precise to be natural geological formations. The survey was published, the permit to excavate was denied. The anomalies are still there. The permit is still denied. Whatever physical evidence of the pre-dynastic administration survives beneath the plateau has not been entered. And the Cairo Museum archive, which holds Selim Hassan's original photographs of the Abydos panel, has restricted access to that specific survey file since 2003. What the museums don't mention is how consistently the pre-dynastic record has been suppressed across 4 separate historical moments. Around 1336 BCE, after Akhenaten's death, the priests of Amun chiseled his oval name rings from every monument in Egypt. Akhenaten had referenced the Shemsu-Hor in his own inscriptions, describing them as the source of the plateau's construction knowledge. After his death, every administrative reference to the pre-dynastic civilizations as real predecessors was removed from the public record. In the 4th and 5th centuries CE, Coptic Christian communities systematically destroyed Egyptian temple archives across the Nile Valley. These archives held the translation traditions and interpretive context that allowed the pre-dynastic sections of texts like the Abydos panel to be understood in their administrative register rather than as mythology. When the archives burned, the ability to read the panel correctly burned with them. Napoleon's 1798 expedition produced the Description de l'Egypte, 23 volumes of documentation. Volume 11 of the first edition, printed in 1810, contains a chapter on the Abydos temple complex that references a lower register inscription in the corridor adjacent to the main king list. That reference was removed from the second edition of 1817. The removed section is listed in the index by plate number. The content is absent. The fourth suppression runs through Zahi Hawass, who controlled Egyptian excavation permits from 2002 to 2011. In 2007, a team from the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago applied for access to the Cairo Museum archive file containing Hassan's 1941 survey photographs of the Abydos panel. The application was declined. The stated reason: the file was under conservation review. The review has not produced a published status report in 17 years. Now here's where it gets active. In 2020, independent researcher and Egyptologist Dr. Joanne Fletcher, whose publication record on Abydos temple material is substantial, submitted a formal request to the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities for permission to conduct a detailed photographic survey of the lower register inscriptions in the Abydos corridor adjacent to the main king list. The ministry acknowledged the application. 14 months later, the response arrived. The corridor in question had been designated a restricted zone pending structural assessment. The structural assessment has not concluded. Fletcher has continued publishing on other Abydos material. She has not published on the lower register corridor since her application was declined. The Zep Tepi withdrawal is the detail that makes the entire panel function as something other than a disaster record. 4 of the 5 entries are tragedies. Civilizations erased by forces they could not survive. The 5th is different in kind. The Zep Tepi are not described as victims. Their entry carries no marker of loss, no verb of destruction, no notation of territory abandoned under duress. The verb is neutral, purposeful. They withdrew. The administrative language of the panel treats this withdrawal with the same tone it uses for the other 4 entries. The same clinical brevity, the same absence of editorial commentary. A succession list does not mourn, it records. And what it records for the Zep Tepi is a departure to a named destination. A destination that the carver of the Abydos panel knew well enough to name, and that we cannot identify. Whatever the first place is, wherever the count began, it existed in the geographical imagination of the scribe who carved this panel as a real location with a real name. Not a spiritual metaphor, not a theological abstraction. A place, named, reached deliberately, by a civilization that chose to go there instead of staying for whatever came next. Now, let me be clear. I am not saying the 5 groups on the Abydos panel are a literal census of 5 technologically advanced civilizations that ruled the Earth for tens of thousands of years. The panel is ancient. It passed through whatever copies and transmission processes produced the version Hassan photographed in 1941. What a scribe carved in the 13th century BCE recorded from an older tradition may carry distortions we cannot account for. But what the panel says, when read in the administrative language it occupies, when read the way a government archivist reads a succession record, not the way a theologian reads a religious text, is a list of 5 groups with 5 specific endings, each ending described with a mechanism, each mechanism different, and each one corresponding to something in the geological record that should not be there if the official timeline of human civilization is the complete picture. What we have to confront is the 5th entry. The Zep Tepi did not flood. They were not shaken loose by the earth. The atmosphere did not kill them. They were not outnumbered into irrelevance. They withdrew, deliberately, to the place where the count began. The Abydos panel, a wall of hieroglyphs in a royal temple built by one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, records this in carved limestone that has stood for 3,000 years. The panel